Yeah. I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you want to ask a question, but as the moderator, I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative just to throw a couple of ideas out. I'm hearing a couple of themes from each one of our panelists. We're hearing about the need to rethink the way the West deals with NGOs and civil society. We're hearing about the need for criteria, to set criteria up in terms of that kind of a choice. And we're hearing about how we're applying Western concepts to the idea, to what we think these organizations are and how we need to support them. Let me throw a couple of things out. Just on the other side of the ledger, I would throw out that there are some models, and I want to ask you about this, particularly you raised Serbia. B92, the independent broadcaster in Belgrade, started out as a dependent of the United States Agency for International Development and has transformed itself into a commercial enterprise and is very much a viable commercial enterprise today. I would say the same for Koha Ditore, the newspaper in Kosovo. The Afghan Human Rights Organization, Independent Human Rights Organization, is a pretty powerful voice, although small but very powerful, and it seems to have a considerable amount of influence in Afghanistan. Similarly for the Afghan media, and looking at Bahrain, there's the Bahraini Human Rights Organization is managing to keep that situation very much in focus. So there are some successful models out there. On the other side of the ledger, perhaps one of you could also comment on what the other concepts of civil society NGOs are. For instance, in Pakistan, you have Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is responsible for the Mumbai atrocity, and yet it is first on the scene with its social services in both the Pakistani earthquake and the flooding that we just saw, substituting its services for the lack of state services. And similarly, in Lebanon, Hezbollah has done the very same thing, and not only is it substituting itself for state services, but it is a part of the government, and it is a beneficiary of at least as far as they've gotten, the democratization of Lebanon as well. So I'm wondering if one of you might, or two of you might want to comment on all of those ideas.
Well, I can say a few words on that, perhaps to begin with. There are certainly some successful examples, and there are also some dependent organizations that are doing good work. I think there are a lot of human rights groups in various countries that do perform a very useful role in monitoring what what is happening in the country, what the situation is for human rights in the countries, and are worth supporting. The examples of these dramatic examples of organizations that start completely dependent and then go on to become commercial enterprises, they exist, but they are few. I think by and large, the more typical situation is the organization that disappears after a few years, essentially never to be seen again. This issue of the civil society organizations that are well rooted in the society, and there are innumerable of these groups. Certainly all the Islamist organizations around the Arab world have a very strong social service component. It's part of the Islamic tradition. It's, you can say it's partly tradition and partly tactic. I mean, you can, and I don't think that it's very easy to separate the two. Those are the very complicated ones. But for one thing, let me give an example, and that to me is really challenging, because the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is not a terrorist organization. They are not going around planting bombs and so on. We will not, no Western NGO support program touches the work that the social assistance side of the Muslim Brotherhood does, and they're the ones who are doing probably the most important work. They run clinics all over the slums of Cairo, and since they are smart politically, they serve the Copts as well as they serve the Muslims. They are not stupid enough to discriminate. They are the ones who provide tutoring for the children, who provide the after schools programs and so on. In many ways, they are the conduit to the they are the conduit to the population. But I think we have, just at the last point here, is we have to distinguish in this thinking about civil society, service delivery organization, and service delivery organizations are always dependent. The ones that provide, in the United States, they may be dependent on the foundations. They may be sometimes they are also dependent on the government and so on. But essentially, an organization that provides health care is always dependent on somebody else. They cannot possibly raise the money for that. What becomes problematic is when we support a dependent organization in the name of political participation. And that is a totally different issue, and that does not work.
Yeah, I think just to follow up on that, I mean, the Afghanistan example is interesting. The AIHRC is extremely influential in the West. Inside Afghanistan, people ignore it, and there are no consequences for that. So when we're looking at actually building up some kind of human rights aware society inside Afghanistan, I mean, they do good work, and the monitoring that they do is effective, but their reports are written first in English and then translated into Dari or Pashto. So, I mean, just kind of from a basic level, they know that their primary audience are Westerners, primarily Americans. And I think you see a lot of that too in the media. Like Tolo TV is a big example I could think of. It started as a USAID project, but now most of Saddam Hussein's sponsors are Iranian. Most of the newspapers in Kabul are funded, at least in part, by Iran. The West is not doing a good job of supporting things like press. I mean, Afghanistan does have a free press, and I'd say that's probably the only functioning part of their public society. But it's not happening because of Western-funded NGO civil society groups. It's primarily happening by other people trying to leverage their influence. When we look at how political organization works, I mean, to this day, under a law sponsored by the United States, political parties are more or less banned in Afghanistan. Part of this is because of a desire to tamp down on the militias. As I said before, the Tanzims, which are the primary organizing groups in the 80s, were kind of combination political parties and militias. To avoid those militias, to avoid the return of the dreaded warlords, a lot of those groups are prevented from directly and officially organizing in government. Because of that, I mean, in a lot of ways, there are barriers to kind of the basic level of political organization that we found. And then also the war gets in the way of that too. That's why Hazaras, despite being a minority, were gaining shares in parliament, because the war prevented Pashtuns and in some cases Tajiks from showing up to the polls to vote. This isn't really a function, I think, of civil society flourishing or of other people being successful. It's just kind of what happens in war because things suck and people can't do what they want to do. All right, that's probably.
I'd like to make three quick points in response to the comments by the moderator and the other speakers. First, I do agree with Marina that a lot of our money is going to NGOs that are not embedded in the societies and disappear when the money goes away. But it's very important, as I mentioned in my presentation, not to confuse NGOs, especially those that are dependent on international funding, with civil society, which is a much broader thing. And in the country that I have studied most deeply, it's Indonesia. Some of these Muslim civil society organizations go back to the days of Dutch rule, long before USAID or anything else. Now, where the role of international assistance comes in, and this, for example, in the excellent work that the Asia Foundation has done, which they don't like to be publicized because it can be controversial, but they have funded activities by these deeply embedded Muslim civil society organizations to do really good work, including new interpretation of the Quran, where they have gone through it to identify scripture that supports values of tolerance and democracy that these organizations do. So there is a very important role for us, but as everyone mentioned, we need to be careful as to who we fund. That takes me to the second point: who should be our interlocutors? And I am not impressed by the arguments that certain Islamist groups are not terrorists and they're not going around blowing up people. The issue is not terrorism. The issue is what values are these organizations propounding. And if a group is not violent, but their agenda includes limitations and restrictions on the rights of women, religious minorities, we have seen attacks on the Copts since democratization in Turkey. I think that's not acceptable from the standpoint of groups that would like to be our interlocutors. The third point, and boy, I can't remember what the third point is at the moment, so I'll let go at that.
The lady right here?
Yes.
There's a microphone now coming to you.
Thank you. My name is Nevzar Stacy. I'm the president of Hasna Incorporated, an NGO in Washington, D.C. I loved what Marina said. I have been working 12 years in southeastern Turkey and Cyprus. And I cannot emphasize that we, the Westerners, I consider myself, since I've lived here too long, a Westerner, have really not been honest with the countries we're trying to help. We have not given them the best examples of what a good NGO is. As you see, there are many organizations in this country that lack a lot of the virtues that we'd like to see in these organizations. We don't have many organizations that put out their income on the website. So we don't abide by many of the things that we'd like other countries, other NGOs to abide. Second, we don't evaluate projects. The point is, whenever I seek money to continue evaluating projects, it is not sexy. So they rather start a project, finish, and then go away. Nobody is interested. And if this is what we are teaching them, why are we surprised that those organizations don't last? European organizations have been giving money to Turkey. It's absolutely appalling that the salaries that they give to people as project directors are totally out of line with what the community can pay or sustain. So what's happening is that we're not teaching at all. Out of desperation, out of our inability to work with these countries, we have chosen to set up these organizations, but we're not willing, really, to teach them what a good civil society organization is. You're right with the values. You're right with the mechanics. It's not raising money. It is understanding what a civil society is and really showing good examples from the United States. We have a long way to go to clean up our act here.
Does anybody want to respond? I think you have universal.
We all agree.
Yeah, universal agreement. The lady.